As I just looked for more stories written for, kind of centered on girls, I realized just, yeah, they're more than maybe when we were kids, but there's still not a lot, and there's still not enough.
As I mentioned, despite everything going on in the world, and particularly all the obnoxious things that this president has been about, you remain exceptionally positive. And I think a lot of that comes through clearly in the writing that you've done. I mean, you've now written 6 books. Is that correct?
I've lost track, but that sounds about right.
That sounds about right. Okay, and
right.
you have.
I think it's like more than one hand. So yeah.
Okay,
right.
more than one hand. You're on the other hand now, so we do know that much.
I'm on the other hand.
Much of what you've written is geared toward children in particular, and helping them have an understanding of our history, of their sense of worth, of a bunch of different things. So you could have written about adults who I know are pretty lame compared to kids. You could have written about a lot of topics. Why did you decide that you wanted to focus in on children's understanding of the world?
So the first book that I wrote for like non-adults was a book called It's Your World, and it was really for kind of preteens and younger teenagers, and it was really a reaction to so many, both young people I met who were already doing amazing work to try to improve their schools, their communities, like our country, our world, and also a reaction to how many other young people I met, including like my nieces and nephews. My husband's one of 11, so we have 20 nieces and nephews.
Oh, wow.
So, and just like, listening to their questions about the world, like, why are there kids who aren't in school? Like, why are there places where girls can't go to school? Like, why is climate change like not something that we all just agree is happening? And like, why aren't we then all doing something about it? I mean, these like pretty basic questions. And so I wrote It's Your World in reaction to kind of those questions and trying to provide some answers, and also to share the stories of some of the amazing young change makers I met to help inspire kind of the first group of kids. And then when I became a parent, especially admittedly the parent of a girl, I realized how many picture books are told kind of from the male point of view, or kind of through a male character's voice, kind of through the male gaze. Like even so many of the ducks or the bears or the frogs, like animals you wouldn't think like would need to really be gendered, like were boys. And then like, as I just looked for more stories written for, kind of centered on girls, I realized just, yeah, they're more than maybe when we were kids, but there's still not a lot, and there's still not enough. And we're certainly like so far from even now, like in 2020, having like an equal number of like picture books being written about and centered on girls. So I wanted to try to help change that. And so that's part of what led to kind of my first She Persisted book. And it also was admittedly a bit of a reaction to kind of the now infamous moment where Senator Warren was trying to read a letter that the great Coretta Scott King had written more than 30 years earlier about the then nomination of Jeff Sessions to the federal bench. And I think it's always the right time to hear from Mrs. King, and think she so deserves to be recognized as the extraordinary civil rights leader that she was in her own right, because she's so often just like a footnote in her extraordinary husband's biography, but she like deserves all of her own books. And, like Senator Mitch McConnell didn't agree that it was the right time to hear her words kind of told in Senator Warren's voice. And he was so frustrated that, she just kept trying to do this, and nevertheless she persisted. So kind of all these things all came together of like, I want to redirect attention on me to women that I think are so extraordinary and that have really inspired me. And clearly we just need more of this in the world and in children's books, and kind of all that meshed together. And that was She Persisted, the first one.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up about Coretta Scott King, because I, over the course of the last year, was able to read her autobiography, which I'd never read before. And it's really remarkable. Yes, she is a book.
Yeah,
exactly. She's a remarkable woman, brilliant, Okay. And as you said, I don't think people realize this because she was understandably in the shadow of one of the greatest humanitarians that ever lived, but she was amazing. And it says something that the word of Coretta Scott King was not good enough to keep Jeff Sessions. You would think of somebody who had an enormous amount of credibility and expertise in, experiencing racism, that her saying that Jeff Sessions was basically too racist to be in any kind of authoritative judicial position would have been enough in most places. But
and
not
it
here.
was enough, right? Like in 1986, it actually was enough.
It was enough, yeah.
In the Senate for the Reagan White House to like withdraw his nomination. So like someone who was too racist to be a judge in 1986 was apparently like okay to be our attorney general in 2017. And then you're like, of course, because it's Donald Trump. And
Right.
by the way, like we are a really racist country, and that sucks, but it's honest, and we got a lot of work to do. And I think you can see how much work we have to do, partly like just in that anecdote, right?
Yeah, that was pretty startling, and I'm not startled often, but that I was like, oh, really, we're doing this? Okay, we are. So you came out with, as you said, She Persisted. That was sort of the first volume. You developed an entire library, and most recently, I don't know if is it actually out yet? She Persisted in Sports, or is it coming out?
It's coming out, but by the time this airs, it will be out.
Okay, so it will be out. So then you take She Persisted into my favorite arena, which is sports, where you're talking about some of the great female Olympians and female athletes of our time. What made you decide to move into the sports arena?
Well, I love sports. I mean, like I grew up playing sports. I grew up watching sports. I watch more television like during the Olympics and the Paralympics every 2 years than probably in the intervening 2 years. Like I just, grew up, especially with my mom and my grandmother, who really kind of would tell me stories. Like for my grandmother, like it was, Babe Dietrichson-Zacharias and Wilma Rudolph, who were especially like inspiring to her. And for my mom, it was like, Billie Jean King and Nadia Comaneci, who were like really inspiring to her. And just how like my mom and my grandmother were like, like casual athletes. Their talents resided elsewhere. But like so much of the inspiration kind of to do what they did like off the field or off the court really came like from these extraordinary women athletes who like not only proved what was possible, but like even created the understanding of like what was possible. And so I just think like sports figures, and I took ballet really seriously as a kid, so also dancers were really important to me, to like help keep my spirits up, to help me keep persisting. So my earliest memories are from like the 1984 Olympics and watching that with my parents. I vividly remember watching FloJo break 2 world records, the 1988 Seoul Olympics, records that are still unbroken in the 100 and 200 meter. And so when I was just thinking about like the next She Persisted, it just felt like, like it has to be about these sports figures that have meant so much to me and to the women in my family, especially. And thankfully, like my extraordinary editor, Jill Santopolo, said yes. And Alexander Boyer, who's illustrated all the books, also loves sports. And so then like we were off to the races, pun intended, I guess.